The sheet had not yet cooled, and the body beneath it seemed to have been created in haste. Rough skin, a heavy head, a voice, low, hoarse, almost masculine. The air in the chambers was thick with steam, frankincense, and blood. The mother remained silent, while the maids rushed to the king without waiting for certainty, a son. But the door opened again. The princess approached slowly, without raising her eyes, and in her arms was the same infant. "Your Majesty, there has been a mistake. It is a girl." And in that second, where destiny was forged, not just a child was born, a body appeared that would call into question the very nature of power, gender, faith. Sweden received not an heir, but a question. Thus was born Christina, the future queen, who both in life and after it would be called anything. A boy in a skirt, a genderless woman, a monarch with a man's soul, a heretical goddess, an hermaphrodite. Nature itself seemed to decide to play chess with the dogmas of the time and went all in on the very first move. Accounts say the newborn's body was covered in thick, dark hair, and her voice was rough, strong, almost growling. For the frightened and superstitious courtiers, it was a sign. For the doctors, an anomaly. For the people, a prophecy. Some whispered of a curse, others of a divine plan. However, few then guessed that this girl, barely brought into the world, had already become a question, not an answer. A paradoxical sign of the times, in which a person, not having lived even a day, already becomes the subject of myth. Sweden gave birth not just to an heiress, but to a riddle that would be unraveled for centuries. Thus begins a story in which no path will be straight, no decision obvious, and every action will be on the edge between politics, art, and pure madness. And yes, it begins with a mistake, but perhaps it is precisely mistakes that launch true history. When the newborn Christina was handed back to the queen, she barely glanced at her daughter. The disappointment was almost palpable, like a sharp smell in the room, not crying out, but dense, viscous. The woman, having recently given birth, did not hide that she had expected a completely different outcome. She did not want a girl, and certainly not one like this, with a robust body, a manly forehead, and a strange, frighteningly confident cry. Gustav II Adolf himself, however, took the event not as a tragedy, but a challenge. He had had to rule against circumstances before. Why not continue now? Soon, he declared, if there were no more sons, then Christina would be his successor. And this was not a gesture of desperation, but calculation, almost cynical. The monarch, accustomed to war and governance, immediately understood. The girl could be useful. She could be raised to suit the throne, made into what her skin, voice, and body were meant to be. From that moment on, a quiet but fundamental substitution began. Christina was not raised as a girl. She was not brought up. She was shaped, like clay kneaded without sentiment. Around the child, a system of education worthy of a commander's son was built. Male mentors, military reviews, Latin and fencing, strategies and psalms, lessons in diplomacy and fortress architecture. In her father's eyes, she was to be a prince. simply with different anatomical parameters. And, strangely enough, Christina coped. She absorbed everything, greedily, without protest, as if this format was originally embedded in her very nature, to survive not through pliability, but through strength. But here it is important to understand. The body of little Christina itself became an arena. Prejudices and desires clashed within it. Biology and power, religious expectations and political demands. The girl who, in other circumstances, would have been dressed in a doll and given a bonnet, learned to ride a horse and shoot an arquebus with precision. She tore lace from her clothes, preferring rough fabrics, masculine cuts, high boots, cloaks, and swords. And she also swore, richly, like a soldier. Her mentors noted, her speech sometimes resembled an officer's tent rather than a royal boudoir. The courtiers chuckled, at first stealthily, then louder and louder, and increasingly behind her back, the ominous word that had been used for centuries to denote the incomprehensible, the frightening, the wrong, Hermaphrodite, was heard. Rumors grew like mold on a warm wall. Was it a boy, or still a girl? Why was she so rough, so strong, so thin, so strange? Why wasn't she afraid of gunpowder and didn't wear perfume? Why didn't she seek protection, but demanded power? Christina was becoming a myth even in childhood, but a myth that no one wanted to understand. It was easier to attach a label than to admit there was something disturbing about her, not because of her gender, but because of the very nature of her otherness. Her independence irritated, her curiosity frightened, her calm disregard for femininity seemed dangerous. And yet, by a strange irony, it was this otherness that became her greatest asset. No woman of that time received such an education. No girl was taught to fight, not metaphorically, but literally. No daughter looked at the map of Europe as a chessboard where the pieces were armies and crowns. While other girls learned catechism and embroidery, Christina memorized the star maps. While childhood friends read Lives of the Saints, she studied anatomical atlases and pondered the structure of the soul, and what to do if it did not fit into the usual vessel. That is why, from an early age, the question of her gender became not a question of anatomy, but a question of power, a question of space. Who is allowed to be as they wish to be, especially if this he was born in her body? And when later Europe would whisper, "Who is she anyway?" the answer would already be known. She is a person in whose body a challenge resided. History became a special subject of fascination for her. She delved into works about ancient rulers, studied the anatomy of power, read chronicles not as dead dates, but as the living fabric of fate. And one day she came across a book about the life of Elizabeth I, the English queen, who was first ridiculed and underestimated, and then began to be feared and respected. This reading was not just interesting for Christina, it became a revelation. In Elizabeth's image, she saw not so much a historical figure as an inner reflection of herself, a woman who managed to survive in a world not made for her, a woman who chose power and solitude over submission and marriage, a woman whose fate unfolded not according to the laws of romantic drama, but according to the logic of a political chess game. From that moment on, Elizabeth's name became a symbol for Christina. not an example for blind imitation, but confirmation that another path was possible. She felt it was not necessary to agree to the role that society considered natural for a woman. It was not necessary to be someone's daughter, wife, or mother to be significant. To remain in history, it was enough to maintain control over one's own life and not betray oneself. Christina grew up quickly, and this maturation was not limited to physical metamorphoses or social ceremonies. She mastered the language of power, learned to understand the structure of the world, observed people and how they made decisions. For her, maturity meant not entering into marriage, but readiness to take responsibility for the country, for fate, for her ideas. She prepared for adult life not for anyone's recognition and not with the goal of pleasing expectations. Her path to maturity was rather an internal decision to become who she felt herself to be, a full-fledged political player. For Christina, upcoming maturity was not a marital union, but an upcoming battle, and she was ready to enter the field, alone but fully armed. By the age of 18, Christina of Sweden was more than just a young queen. She had become a phenomenon, contradictory, inconvenient, paradoxical. Her figure combined characteristics incompatible for her time: authority and youth, femininity and contempt for it, solitude and power. She no longer needed guidance, did not ask for approval, and did not tolerate interference. The crown was no longer a symbol passed down to her by inheritance. It became a personal choice. It was then, on the eve of her coronation, that Christina officially declared she was taking the reins of power into her own hands, without a chancellor, without regents, without conventions. The old courtiers, accustomed to whispering about her in the third person, were now forced to bow their heads before the one they had recently discussed as a strange girl with a masculine character. Their smirks froze, their doubts turned into awkward silence.
The writer and historian Pavel Kovalevsky described this period of Christina's life with admiration and fear. In his book, she appears as a figure who simultaneously inspires and frightens, too independent, too bold, too free. A young woman who not only commanded men, but did so with ease, without excuses, as if it were natural. She led Senate meetings, made judgments on foreign policy, intervened in military matters, and all this with a tone that left no doubt: before you stood a ruler. The Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, became an arena for her to assert power. It was there that Christina delivered a speech in which she rejected the imposed path. No, she would not marry. No, her succession would not be secured through marriage. She herself would choose her successor, and that person would be her cousin, Charles Gustav Falz. A pause hung in the hall. Not just from surprise, but from the unpreparedness to accept such a thing. A woman refusing to be a virgin queen only on paper was now doing so officially, loudly, defiantly, fearlessly. In this act, one felt not just political independence. It was an act of resistance to the very structure of a world where a woman's birth automatically meant a path of submission. Christina broke the rules not for the sake of a gesture, but because she didn't know how and didn't want to act otherwise. She was not going to be a wife. She did not want to bear heirs. She did not dream of a lavish wedding. She was interested in only one marriage, a union with history. But history, as is known, is a jealous partner. Soon, Christina began to face resistance, not overt, not armed, but much more dangerous. It was resistance of habit, resistance of structure, resistance of the silent network of male expectations. Even her former mentor, Axel Oxtianera, a man of intelligence and subtlety, was not ready to relinquish control. He still believed he could influence the queen, guide her, if not directly, then through an alliance, through marriage, even a fictitious one. It was rumored that he dreamed of marrying Christina to his own son, thus uniting power and loyalty in one bloodline. But it soon became clear such dreams would remain only shadows of the unattainable. Christina had already gone beyond anyone's plans. She stopped listening to his advice. She began to form her own circle, new confidants, favorites, scholars, poets, travelers, artists, people whose views were as sharp and peculiar as her own. These were not just courtiers. They were the living gallery of the era, beautiful, daring, talented, questionable.
But tension also grew, especially between her and Oxenstierna, who felt he was losing ground. In his eyes, she was no longer just a headstrong girl. She was becoming a force he no longer controlled. And this frightened him far more than all the foreign policy threats. For Christina, however, everything that was happening was liberation. For the first time, she felt power not as a form of duty, but as a way to be herself. And in this liberation, the very note that would lead her to a future, unexpected, daring, impossible, was already sounding. But for now, she stood at the head of the state, young, uncompromising, surrounded by admirers, enemies, and legends that were created about her during her lifetime. And all this before she was even officially crowned. Christina's long-awaited coronation took place when she was 24. The official accession to the throne was not so much an act of power as a ceremony of theatrical self-proclamation, a lavish, opulent, solemn event in which ancient rituals intertwined with political farce. Processions walked through the streets of Stockholm, trumpets blared, the people threw flowers, not suspecting that the crown, just placed on their ruler's head, had already begun to weigh her down. Indeed, just 4 years later, Christina would announce what no one expected. She was abdicating the throne. Sweden froze in bewilderment. Why? For what purpose? What went wrong? There was no answer. There were only rumors, guesses, and, as always in Christina's case, legends. The historian Natalia Basovska wrote that by the time of her abdication, Christina was already in a state of moral bankruptcy. Not intellectual or political, but moral, almost existential. The country was exhausted, the army at its limit, finances in decline. There were many reasons, and almost all led to her. Her court resembled a mirage,
dazzlingly beautiful but empty. Too much gold, too many flatterers, too many theatrical gestures behind which reality disappeared. Christina spent money like an inspired Renaissance patron, as if she were managing not a kingdom, but a personal utopia. She showered her favorites with reckless generosity. Lands, titles, money, everything that could be given away became a way to express sympathy or gain loyalty. This was not a governmental style, but emotional prodigality that step by step undermined the state's foundation. Outwardly, she remained strong. She held receptions, wrote decrees, maintained her composure, but inner fatigue grew, a sense of a dead end, where all paths led to one door, an exit from the role, an exit from the scheme.
One of the reasons rarely spoken about openly was religion. Christina, raised in a Lutheran country, was increasingly inclined towards Catholicism. This was not just a spiritual search, it was an escape from moral asceticism, from the tedious Puritanism of Swedish Lutheranism, which seemed to her not just boring, but stifling. Among her retinue, foreign diplomats, representatives of Catholic courts, appeared more and more often. One of them, Antonio Pimentel, the Spanish envoy, became not only a friend to Christina, but, according to rumors, an ideological inspirer. It was he, as some historians suggest, who pushed her to the idea that spiritual liberation was possible only by breaking with Sweden. There was both drama and liberation in this. Christina gradually understood that she could not be queen without ceasing to be herself, and remaining herself in conditions where every gesture was perceived as a symbol and every action as a threat to order meant destroying either the country or her own personality. Sweden wanted only one thing from her: stability, marriage, heir, dynastic succession. But Christina refused. Everything and at once. She was not going to give birth, did not want to submit, did not believe in the family model of power. And at some point, this mismatch between her essence and her royal role became unbearable. The abdication was not an act of defeat. It was a gesture of challenge, almost poetic. Officially, she declared that she was handing over the throne to Charles Gustav, the same cousin she had appointed successor several years earlier. But that was not the point. The main thing was she renounced the very mechanism of power. She refused to be a crowned function. She refused to play along. She renounced the spectacle that no longer even irritated her, only bored her. And now she was no longer queen. She was a woman in a man's suit, leaving the country to feel free for the first time in her life. Christina left Sweden not as a fugitive, but as an actress who had finished her loudest role. There was no hysteria, no pathos, no despair in her departure. Rather, a long-awaited, quiet resolution. She took few things with her, but many books, a little gold, but a mass of memories, a few clothes, but a whole archive of thoughts that fit into no religion, no culture. The main change was that now she could finally be herself, at least in how she looked. For the first time, without supervision and regulations, she dressed as she felt, in a dark mail suit with gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. Her gait, voice, posture, manner of looking, everything betrayed her as a being existing beyond gender. She wasn't playing a man. She simply wasn't playing anyone else anymore. On her way to Europe,
Christina stopped in Brussels, where her official conversion to Catholicism took place. The sacrament was almost intimate, without fanfare, but the significance of this event was colossal. For Europe, she became a symbol, a woman who abdicated the throne for faith. For the Vatican, a trophy in an ideological struggle. For Sweden, a final loss.
Her meeting with the Pope was symbolic and almost anecdotal. It was said that Christina, firmly shaking Pope Innocent X's hand, squeezed it with such force that the old man nearly fainted. Later, doctors advised the pontiff not to subject himself to such handshakes unnecessarily. This was not a malicious joke, but an illustration of her character. Even at the moment of passing under the authority of a new religion, Christina remained an inconvenient figure, belonging only to herself. The Pope hoped that Christina would become a missionary, a quiet but influential agent of Catholicism in the Protestant North. However, it soon became clear that the new convert had no intention of being an instrument of anyone's plans. She made it clear Sweden would not accept Catholics. If missionaries were sent there, they would at best be met with sticks, and at worst, certainly not with kindness. For Christina herself, the transition to Catholicism was not an act of obedience, but another gesture of personal choice. She did not become a deeply devout believer in the classical sense, did not retreat to a monastery, did not follow the path of religious asceticism. But Catholic culture, with its Baroque aesthetics, theatricality, philosophical complexity, turned out to be closer to her than the dry, rational Lutheran strictness. Life without a throne opened up new freedom for her, but also new uncertainty. She began to travel across Europe as a wandering thinker, an eternal foreigner. She was welcomed at courts, invited to dinners, admired, and at the same time shunned. She was a riddle, and this riddle too easily turned into a threat. It was rumored that she began a romance with Cardinal Decio Azzolino, a man of extraordinary beauty, intelligence, and strangely accessible to the former queen. Their relationship was discussed in whispers as something impossible and almost blasphemous. A Catholic cardinal and an abdicated queen, a man under the church's wing and a woman without a crown, but with an unyielding will. No one knew what was really between them. Their correspondence was both platonic and passionate, elevated and tense. But one thing is clear. Azzolino became for Christina someone with whom she could conduct an intellectual dialogue, without filters, without gender boundaries, without church officialdom. He didn't want to change her, he listened, and perhaps that was the most important thing in their connection. Meanwhile, Europe continued to watch her with admiration and fear. Who was she? A woman who renounced power, an hermaphrodite who fled gender, a heretic with clean hands, a queen who became a wanderer. No one knew the exact answer, but therein lay her strength. Christina forever remained outside of classifications. When she appeared in Rome, the citizens greeted her with rapture. They called her the exiled goddess, the Swedish Virgin, or simply the Northern Enigma. She justified none of these nicknames, but she also did not object. For Christina, the main thing was not what she was called, but that she no longer belonged to anyone, neither nation, nor religion, nor gender, nor role.
Christina spent her last years in Rome, a city where antiquity lived side by side with theater, where every stone held someone's intrigues, victories, and falls. It was a stage on which she stepped without a script, but with a powerful inner monologue. She no longer ruled or interfered in state affairs, but her influence did not weaken. On the contrary, she became an informal center of gravity among intellectuals, diplomats, artists. Conversations about philosophy, science, religion buzzed in her residence. She no longer belonged to one people. Christina became a citizen of Europe, and sometimes seemed not of this world at all. Her life was full of paradoxes. A woman who left the throne for faith caused irritation to the Pope himself. A queen surrounded by rumors of her bisexuality entered into close relationships with a cardinal. A Christian who despised Lutheran morality never became a submissive Catholic. She was someone who could not be used, neither by politics, nor by the church, nor by morality. And the whispers around her did not subside. Even decades after her youth, Christina continued to be discussed as an anatomical riddle. They said her body was male, her habits male. In bed, you couldn't tell who. Her letters to her friend, Ebba Spar, continued to be interpreted as confessions of love. There were indeed lines in them that would make a contemporary's hands tremble. I am all yours. No one can take you from me, except death. But this was the language of her time, the language of closeness, of deep connection in which carnal passion was not always present. Christina and Ebba slept in the same bed, but in those centuries this did not necessarily mean scandal. In 17th century Sweden, even royal chambers were cold, and sleeping in the same bed meant sharing warmth rather than secrecy. And Christina herself, it seemed, did not strive to be understandable. She preferred to remain herself, understated, multi-layered, irreducible. After her passing, in 1689, not only history remained, but also a mass of questions. Her body was buried in the Vatican, next to pontiffs, an astonishing end for a woman born in a Lutheran country, renowned for her independence and refusal to submit. This was not just an acknowledgement of her significance, it was an acknowledgement that she had broken free of all possible categories. Christina entered history as a woman who did not become a woman in the usual sense, as a monarch who refused power, as a believer who did not fit into canons, as a figure whose existence was an act of resistance in itself. She was not a saint, but neither was she a sinner. She was not a martyr, but she did not seek glory. She simply went her own way, sometimes feverish, sometimes wasteful, sometimes tragic, but always authentic, and in this lies her main strength.